As it stands, talking to this camera completely solo without another person feels pretty strange. And if you're listening to this, I'm also talking to a camera, which seems to be the more challenging thing for me to overcome. But this is something I'm prepared to become accustomed to. So if it feels awkward or imprecise or something like that, then yeah, that's what it is. I'm learning as I'm doing. I would recommend you do the same. And in part, to demonstrate that, I want to talk about why I'm doing the podcast at all. And it's largely because I like talking to people about their training, but also their reasons for training. So their aspirations and the stuff that relates to training, such as how they integrate it within the rest of their lives, whatever those might look like, kids, work, competing responsibilities, and also nutrition, recovery, sleep. So basically everything. And I'll have that sort of conversation with anyone. If I'm at a kid's birthday party and you look at me and I look like someone that trains, and so you start to talk to me about the things that you do, that tends to be an engaging sort of conversation for me. I'd rather talk about that than the weather. And it had occurred to me that I could probably have those sort of conversations with interesting people that have done quite a lot in the sporting world and in other domains, and that otherwise have an emphasis on their physical fitness, even if it's not with elite performance aspirations in mind. All of that is interesting to me. And with a lot of these people, there's things I want to know. So I'm coming at it from a place of curiosity and trying to learn a thing or two, ultimately, so I can help myself, help the people I coach, help my family, help in general people do things more efficiently. So if myself and others that are at the fringes of human performance have done things right or done things wrong, I'd rather that humanity, or at least my audience, Fifth Off Life, can benefit from that experience so that your path is more efficient and so that you're not making all the same mistakes that I am. So if I'm having these conversations with interesting people from a place of curiosity and they're willing to have these conversations with me, then it's a matter of, well, why wouldn't I do that? And there were reasons for the longest time, some of them ridiculous, like what would I call it? How do I put it up on the webosphere? Even though I've had a podcast before, when things evolve, the platforms and software, that all changes. And so there's some uncertainty there. And part of what I like to do is know what I'm going to be on the hook for before I agree to do something. And because of the uncertainty, I basically just didn't move forward, even though this felt like a good idea for years. Because of that uncertainty, even will people say yes to talking with me? Will people want to listen? All those reasons meant that I just didn't get started. And it got to a point there wasn't anything in particular, but I decided that it would be better to just start and to figure it out as I went, much like this Solo Sam podcast today. It will evolve over time, and like anything I do, I intend to do it better as I learn how. But I didn't want the inability to be perfect to be the reason not to start, which is why this is going to be most likely pretty well unedited. I'm still figuring out what software makes sense and what format do I chop it up, so that people with minute attention spans can only get any of the information, or I just make it a little bit more organic, which is just to press record and to start from a place of willingness and openness and curiosity and just move it forward, which is what I've done so far with the episodes where I'm talking to people. And I really enjoyed it so far. I've got several more banked. I've got several more conversations organized. So I'm putting out one a week, putting out one episode a week, but I'm tend to be recording two ish a week. So some weeks more, no less at this stage. So there's some banked and there's more coming, and I'm committed to doing this for a while, and I've gotten good feedback. So if you've been listening and enjoying, feel free to let me know, but it may even be more productive to let other people know all of the stuff, like if it's on YouTube or if it's on Spotify, and you can subscribe or follow or like, comment, engage with it. If that feels good for you, then do that, just because it increases the likelihood of me doing this longer and better. At the moment, it's a hobby I take seriously. Now I take my training very seriously, and that's borderline hobby profession. I'm not a professional athlete, although it does help contribute to the overall way I make money, but I'm not paid based on how I perform. So it falls into this serious enthusiast category, which is what I am with podcasting. With the solo episodes, I wanted to take the opportunity both to talk more than I might normally if I'm speaking with a guest, because if I have someone coming on, I'm in principle the host, and I'm trying to have a conversation. So we're sharing ideas, but I'm also have things I want to know. And usually the guest is coming in. I don't presume that they want to know anything about me. They just have to be willing to have the conversation. And by the time I'm looking at them digitally, they've done as much as that they agree to. And if they're a good dance partner when it comes to a conversation, that's great. But they don't need to have the same curiosity or the desire to want to learn things as I do. That's what I do for myself and on behalf of the listener. But that doesn't mean that I don't have a point of view that I want to share about training or the stuff that's peripheral to it. And it's also probably a good spot to be able to talk about my own training at a little bit more length. When it comes to something like Instagram, you can capture, hey, this is what I'm doing, and it's the bit more of the sets and reps, and not an awful lot about the, hey, this is how I'm thinking about it. This is some of the why. And so I'm going to do that here. And today I will talk about what I'm training for those that don't know, and a little bit more about why I think it can be done and what's the drive behind it. And so for those of you that don't know, the goal is and then I'll answer some questions which have kindly been sent in by some of you listeners. To begin with, my training, for those of you that don't know, I'm training for a 300 kilogram deadlift and a sub 3 hour marathon. The appeal of it is that doing a triple bodyweight deadlift has been a goal of mine, and I've got within the ballpark, but not quite. So I've deadlifted 320 a couple of times. I've deadlifted 300 a bunch of times, but never at the body weight that I would need to be in order to run a sub 3 hour marathon. At the same time, I'm not trying to be as heavy as possible and run a sub 3 hour marathon, because that's going to make it harder than it needs to be. So there's probably this sweet spot around 100 kilos, which is about 5 kilos less than I am currently, where I can both deadlift triple body weight and run a sub 3 hour marathon. As far as I'm aware, and I would love to be better informed if such information exists, but I don't know of anyone over 100 kilos that's run under 3 hours for a marathon. I know of guys that are strong that run ultras, and I know of guys that are 80, 85 kilos, 90 kilos that may have run in that ballpark, but I like these round numbers, and I'm not 85 kilos. So, and I can't, well, at least at this stage, run a marathon properly fast, in part because of my frame, but I reckon I could run under 3 hours, and I'm interested in doing things that haven't been done before. If the person exists that has done this before, point me in that direction, because that'd be great. And with that in mind, given that I have deadlifted 320 and I haven't run under 3 hours, this sub 3 hours is probably the A priority, but it's also that because it's going to require the most work. I've been working more consistently at strength over the last decade than I have the aerobic side of things. And I'm not sure if I'll do it this week or next, but illuminate a little bit of what that looks like in terms of the immediate preparation over the last 6 months, but also the last, say, 6, 10 years, or let's say it's 12 years since I stopped rowing. So there's been a lot of training, but less formal training, and plenty of visibility, but not complete clarity as to what's been going on. Because on Instagram, you can say I did this session, I lifted this weight, but it rarely captures the whole thing. And in my case, it certainly has not. When it comes to the marathon, why I believe it can be done, even if it hasn't been done, is in 2009, I ran a 3:14 marathon at the Hobart Marathon. I think it was January 3-ish, 2009, which was a few months after the Beijing Olympics. My preparation for that was okay in that despite it being in this sort of immediate Olympic window and the fact that I was rowing again a lot in the single scull and a lot on the erg, I wanted to run the marathon, so I was kind of juggling rowing and running training. And prior to Beijing, hadn't really been doing any running outside of little bits here and there, but nothing meaningful. But there's this shiny object of the marathon, and I thought sub 3:15 was a really realistic aspiration. Don't know what information I had to believe that was the case. I think it was because I'd in training, and if I went for a run, it was not uncommon for me to run a sub 90-minute half marathon. So sort of extrapolate out, that's in keeping with that as a performance, all else being equal. And so a 3:14, but in the training for it, there was maybe the last 6 weeks, the vast majority of it. And to tell the longer version of the story, because why not? Here. I had a rib stress injury, which is not uncommon for rowers because of the amount of single sculling I was doing. And I went in to see the doctor about that. I'd also been having some shin tenderness from the running volume that I was building. And so I was seeing the doctor because it was a New South Wales Institute of Sport doctor that in principle was seeing me there because I was a rower, but I was going to get a 2-for-1. So I was, I got this rib injury, da 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 da. What do you think I should do? And then also my shins are hurting a lot. I think it's because I've been running. I have this event I'm training for, and unless things go really badly, I'm going to do that. So let's talk about workarounds rather than just simply not running. And well, I was sort of determined to just keep running. So I said to the doctor, if I just keep doing that, what will happen? And he said, well, your shin splints, which you have, will turn into stress fractures. And I was like, okay. And then if I keep going, it's like, oh, then they will just, maybe your shins will completely break, and then you'll have to get surgically put back together. And so that seemed avoidable, like something to avoid if possible. But I wanted to keep running. So I spent, I think it was 4, 5, 6 weeks running mostly on soft sand. And when I say mostly, almost all of my running volume was just in the soft sand at the back of Bondi Beach, just running back and forth, which is a different type of running, but it was the closest thing to running that I could do that would still allow me to keep up with anything closely related to the thing that I was training for. And I could nurture my shins through enough that meant that I could roll around and was ready to go on the day. Now, on the day, it was in Hobart, it's in Tasmania for those of you that aren't aware. And I got in not late the night before, but late enough that dinner was later than it would normally be. And I had this sort of, I thought I'd get a pizza because that wouldn't be uncommon for me to get before a big session and even before a big run. But this pizza, even though it was, the best pizza in Hobart, was pretty gross and couldn't eat it all, which is not great because that's very rare for me. And so I'm sort of begrudgingly eating this pizza, and it's 9 p.m. and I know that I need to be on the start line at 7, which means I need to be fully evacuated. This pizza needs to be in and out prior to that. And it wasn't. Just like the long and short of it, it was not. So I had to stop 3 times during that marathon to like run off the course if there was a public toilet, or at least duck behind the bushes and evacuate my bowels, which isn't optimal. So I'm looking at these touch points, the shin injury and the extent to which that affected training, and then the execution on race day. I'm like, that was not ideal and unprofessional at the time, something I could definitely avoid doing again. And then there's quite a bit in the training that I thought, okay, well, if given the shot to do this again, this is what I would do better. So it would probably be more body management, stuff, soft tissue work, management of mobility, more variation in training intensity. So instead of just, I'm going to go out for a run, and it was more or less the distance or the duration in terms of time is what determined the intensity, because I was going to run it at about marathon speed regardless. I felt like if I wasn't running at marathon pace, then it was kind of useless. So it was marathon pace or faster, which I think was around 4:30, 4 minutes 30 per kilometer. Now, I would think this go around, there's a lot more that I could do that would give it some useful structure to elicit adaptations that would make the training itself more sustainable in terms of injury prevention, and then to not do stupid things in the immediate lead up. And so with the benefit of that was that 2009. So what's that? 15 years, 16 years ago. I've learned a lot in that time, and I've accumulated some wear and tear, but not so much that I can't still go hard. And this is fundamentally, this is the same skeleton with the same aerobic system that I can leverage. And I have the benefit of all of the training that I've accumulated. What I don't have is sort of recent year after year consistency when it comes to the most significant component, which is this aerobic system and running economy. So running efficiency, the ability to run fast easily. I don't have that, but I believe it's attainable. And so I'm going through the process of inching along, getting more efficient as I go, as I can put in more volume and tolerate more volume. And I'll talk about that next time, but I wanted to talk about why I think it's achievable and how I thought about doing it. So as I've said, the goal is the 300 kilo deadlift and the sub 3 hour marathon. And I believe that they're doable in a pretty condensed period of time, so that I could do it either the deadlift one day and then the marathon the following day, or perhaps even do the deadlift in the morning and the marathon in the afternoon. There's different trade-offs with each, and I'll talk about that. But a lot of people have, well, not a lot, some have said, in what order would you do it? And to me, it's a no-brainer. The deadlift, if you can do it, I would hope that it's not it won't be the heaviest thing I've ever picked up in it. I'm aiming for it not to be a grinder. So all the cost would be the warming up, which is sufficient and not extensive. And then you're lifting one load one time, which doesn't accumulate a lot of fatigue. Now, there's a fair amount of nervous system activation. So it's not nothing, but not anything that I believe would be that detrimental to a marathon performance either later that day or that afternoon or the following day. And what I'm doing is training in order to be able to do that. And that in terms of what's going to happen on what day is still to be determined. And I can say it's still to be determined because it's still far enough off into the horizon that I don't exactly know when it'll happen. I know that there's certain times of the year when it can't happen here based on the temperature and the humidity. So for those that aren't across the thermal load, which is the say the heat load on the body, and the fact that a bigger body with more muscle is more susceptible to heat. So I think I tolerate the heat pretty well, but that would just be compared to people of a similar size, not compared to, well, it's basically the clock that's carrying, not another person. So if the distance and the clock are these kind of unmovable characteristics, then optimizing for temperature and humidity so that it's cooler and less humid makes far more sense than trying to both train for and then execute the marathon in hotter and more humid temperatures, which it definitely is currently. So the goal would be to do it in the Australian winter, most likely around July or August. Now, there are some marathons around then in terms of targeted events, and the one that it would make the most sense, and it tends to be in the first week of July each year, is the Gold Coast Marathon. It's about an hour away from where I live. So I could do the deadlift here and then drive up there, stay overnight, run the marathon in the morning, under 3 hours, tickety boo, tick, tick, great, job done. That's one way to do it. And it would probably be the most palatable in terms of there would be no question about the validity of the marathon, and there'd be certain things I wouldn't have to organize because I could just get my start number, get my bib number and stand on the start line. On your marks, and we go. And there'd be a pacer, and there's a course, and maybe some atmosphere. The challenge is that because a marathon and the Gold Coast Marathon is similar to them all, which is they start pretty early for this temperature thing. So they don't want too many runners to be going too far into the middle of the day, because even in July on the Gold Coast, it can get quite warm. I think it'll get to the mid or low 20s, which isn't hot, but when you're finishing a marathon, it's quite warm. So all of the global marathons where people are going fast, they tend to be in pretty cold conditions. So they're in the fall. In the US, for example, I'd imagine the same in the UK and Europe. Over here, it can be a little bit different. The Hobart Marathon, for example, is in January in Tasmania, but Tasmania is a bit chillier. And the reason I'm talking about these events is, well, it's not just a location, but it's also a time of year. And I could aim for Tasmania, but it's a little bit hillier, perhaps not as fast in terms of a course. So aiming for a course that's relatively flat or fast, so it could have some undulations, but not enough that would slow me down needlessly. And then to have that be at a place where I could deadlift without funky equipment the day before, or the day of, if that were possible, which it likely isn't because of the early start times. So a 300 kilo deadlift should be achievable, but it's not going to be as achievable at 4 a.m. or whenever I need to do it if I intended to do both on the same day with an official marathon. So the alternative, if I wanted to do it on the same day or just not be tied to an arbitrary date on the calendar that has to be organized sufficiently ahead of time in a major city for it to happen. I don't necessarily have that restraint. It should be done whenever it makes sense in terms of when I'm prepared and when the conditions make sense, and that may align with a marathon that's official, and may not. And it may mean that in order to do it the same day, which I think is probably a more impressive performance, that I would need to do a Strava marathon, which is to say that I would figure out where the course is ahead of time. I have a few in mind, but you need somewhere that's relatively flat, somewhere where you can probably set up some aid stations, some hydration along the way. And then you would need to have one or two GPS devices. And you're doing your 42.195 kilometers, or call it 42.2, to make sure of it. And that would likely quench my thirst in that I would know it's sufficiently valid. It's just a matter of whether it would appease everyone else. And the good news is I don't need to determine it right now. I'll probably refine over time what it looks like, and I'll need to, because as I get closer, the training will need to get more specific. But if it's not this winter, which is in the next few months, then it's more likely to be next winter. So we're talking maybe a year and a half away. Those things are to be determined in terms of what's going to happen on what day, and I'm training for both contingencies now. So there's days when I'm doing my weights, lifting weights, and then going for a run. And then there's days where I'm lifting weights and then I'm treating a smaller run after it as what would be a warm up for a marathon or a solid training effort the following day. So even now, my training I'm developing these attributes that I'll need in order to be able to do the things that I want to do. And as it gets closer, that will become more and more refined. But at this stage, it just needs to be heading in the right direction, which it is, and which I can talk about a little bit more next time. What I do want to do now is I could probably talk a little bit more about the purpose and what I hope to get out of it, which is probably not something that I've elaborated on previously to my athletic feats when I've intended to do something, even if I've said, hey, I want to do this thing. There's usually there's a reason, there's an expectation in terms of what degree of likelihood do I think this is achievable. So, for example, when I was training for the 1,000-meter world record on the indoor row machine, in my mind, it was, if I did the training, I could do the thing. So it wasn't this like, I don't know if I can do it. It was, I believe I can do it, and now I just need to put in the work to actually go ahead and do it. And that's what happened. The 500-meter world record, on the other hand, I knew would be a stretch. And so in my mind, I'd always framed it as I'm going to attempt to do this thing because I didn't know if it was achievable, but the 1,000-meter I did. So I think to people outside, it kind of looks like the same thing, but to me, it was different, which didn't change the intensity or the intent of the preparation, but it changed a little bit how I was interpreting the results. So for this, I think it's achievable if I can survive the training. And because I'm not in a rush, trying not to be, I think that I have a high ability to survive the training. So I just need to be able to find a process that's sufficient in terms of eliciting performance benefits, but also sustainable enough that I can train long enough to make significant enough changes, which I'm going to need to make, because as of today, I'd be closer in terms of the deadlift than the marathon, but I wouldn't be especially close on either. I have pretty good general traits at the moment in terms of I'm generally strong and generally fit, but I'm generally fit in a lot of domains, and I'm generally strong in a lot of domains, but athletic performance is specific to task. And because I know I don't need to have my deadlift maxed out right now, I don't. And because running hasn't been a goal or an aspiration or even a thing that I've done for the last 10 years, not being a natural runner, I'm not in running shape at all. well, at least I wasn't when I started. So it felt like starting from scratch with my understanding that I have some not only muscle memory, but experiential memory of running long distances and that being very normal. But I also knew that that only occurred when I was in good running shape, which I'm not, although I'm inching in that direction. So things have been going better when I remain patient, and I'll elaborate on what that looks like next time. But I believe everyone watching or listening should perhaps understand how I'm thinking about the execution and also why both of them, because I think I can do both of them, and because the triple bodyweight deadlift and the sub 3 hour marathon have been these long-standing goals of mine. And although plenty of people have done a triple bodyweight deadlift and 300 kilo deadlift, and plenty of people have run under 3 hours for a marathon, I don't know of anyone that's done both, and certainly not on the same day. And I don't know of anyone that's, like I've said, been in triple digits in terms of body weight and run that fast. So I'm trying to do some things that haven't been done before, and that's appealing to me. That's when people do that, I'm more likely to have them on the podcast because there's things that we get to learn, especially as someone had to go about a process where they were training to do a thing that hadn't been done before. So there's immediate uncertainty or things unknown about how to prepare for it. How do you train to do something that hasn't been done before? It's not like you can look at the blueprint of someone else and go, oh, that'll work, because it's not necessarily replicable. I can't just look at a marathon program to run under 3 hours because it doesn't necessarily account for my size and it doesn't account for what else I'm trying to do. And if anyone but me were trying to do it, they'd have to balance these things as well. And I would be interested in talking to them. So I get the benefit of the experience, and I would hope that I'd get the sense of achievement and the nice feeling that occurs when you feel like you've cracked a nut or solved a problem. That would be great. So there's a lot of reasons for me. I also haven't been in the competitive domain for a while. I had a low-level existential crisis when it was basically start of the pandemic, and I was 124 kilos because I was trying to be as strong as possible. But there was no powerlifting competitions anywhere anytime soon. And so I just felt, okay, well, I'm heavier than I need to be. I'm not even this strong guy going to the gym. I was just a big guy sitting mostly in an apartment trying to train at home. And then my wife got pregnant, and for the first time, there was some feelings of, well, I don't want to die soon, especially, which was new because prior to that, and this was at about 38 years old, I hadn't thought about health much at all. So everything was performance, and then health was a means to an end. And so it occurred to me, oh, I need to pay more attention to health to prioritize that when I'd previously just been prepared to sacrifice it willingly if it increased performance. So that meant that stress was just this means to an end. So more, yeah, great. If I can absorb it, I can. I wasn't really thinking about the costs acutely or over the long term. It was just about survival, what I could tolerate, not what I could thrive with. So the mentality, even my approach to training was more do or die than it needs to be. And I wanted to course correct a little bit with this longevity component, which I hadn't factored in at all. So there was just some adjustments, including losing some weight, adding in some more cardio training, adding in more mobility stuff, or at least be more consistent with it. And then things progressed to a point where these aspirations seemed reasonable, even if I knew that the starting point was not anywhere near going to be not going to be anywhere near the end point. And so I'm somewhere along that process now, a little closer to the goals than I was before, but with the understanding that there's a hell of a lot of work ahead of me. As I said, I'll talk about the specifics of what it's been looking like, what I've been doing, what the challenges have been, what the learnings have been next week. As for right now, I'm going to answer a few questions. Thanks to those that have submitted this in. First question, this is pretty closely related to what I've been talking about in terms of goals. And how about I just fucking read it? How do you know when a big scary goal is too big? Not the absurdly unrealistic goals. That's easy. I mean, the line between something pretty massive but potentially achievable versus something that theoretically could happen if every single star aligned, but which most likely will not happen. Okay, so this is more or less asking what's the difference between my approach to the 1,000, which I talked about, and the 500, where one was massive but potentially achievable versus theoretically could happen if every single star aligned, but which most likely I wasn't thinking in terms of most likely that it won't happen, but that it would be a stretch. So the way I think about this is that we don't know what we're capable of, and that the only way to know what we can achieve is to put in the work to get there. So if something's a big, lofty goal, but you're aware of, in principle, of what it's going to take to get there, and then you're prepared to do that, if you're prepared to do the work and then see how it goes, then nothing can be too scary. And it should be something that you aspire to. And now that can be more or less reasonable if we're talking about marathon performance, for example, that you have to draw the line somewhere, because I could say, oh, under 3 hours, but why not under 250 or 245? And at some point, for me, but for everyone, it is going to be unachievable. But if you're reflecting on your prior performances, which is context, and what it took for you to achieve those prior performances in terms of effort and discipline and consistency and all that stuff, and how hard or easy that felt, and if you feel like there's room for improvement, both in terms of your quality and volume and execution. Can you do things better, not just harder and do more, but harder and do more, if you can well tolerate it, is going to unlock more performance potential. I would say that we've only got this one life, and to put a cap on what's achievable when you don't know, when you haven't done all those things that you think might help, then you've already limited yourself and you've decided it's unachievable, and then you decide not to do it, and then you go about your life with this lack of resolution where you know that you didn't really give it a full crack, that you ruled it out because it was in your mind unachievable. And then you have to spend the rest of your days with this sort of feeling where you wonder whether or not you should have even attempted to do that thing. I'd much rather give it a crack, and if it goes well, then great. And if it doesn't, well, great. I still get the knowledge that I gave it a crack. And part of what I do, at least, is either way, I'm going to learn from it, and either way, I can share those learnings with people I work with directly, but people that I'm talking to, such as my listeners here and my viewers. So there's benefits even if it doesn't go well. And that seems to me an easier pill to swallow than just not giving it a go. If you think about it and think in terms of, well, if the juice is the goal and the squeeze is the process required to achieve that goal, then you could decide, after thinking about what would be required, maybe I could do it, but I don't know if I'm prepared to do all of that work in order to do that thing. Then you don't get to do that thing. But you can also, just be a solid enough human being to acknowledge that and say, own it. Maybe I could do this. I'll never know because I'm not prepared to put in the work. And then you can just live with that too. I hope that answer the question, or at least gave you some perspective on how to think about it. I like big, hairy goals. I, yeah, I wouldn't prejudge the likelihood before you've actually given it a full crack. And when I say a full crack, some people they think, oh, I want to get strong, so they'll train. They're like, so what's a 12-week program? And I think like, no, think in terms of like 12 years. Put in years. I'm prepared to put in years to find out. With powerlifting, I was like, I'll put in years to see how strong I could be, and I reckon if I kept going, I could still be stronger and than I have ended up being if I kept with it. But I gave it a multi-year crack, which to me is more notable in terms of being able to understand what's possible than doing a 12-week effort or something like that. But then this also comes down to what sort of person you are and where you get your funsies from. So I'll leave that with you. Okay, number two, would love to know your opinion on programming for first responders who have to develop wide GPP, which is general physical preparedness, but whose lives and schedules are constantly disrupted, recovery compromised, etc. Okay, well, when it comes to general physical preparedness, the clue is in the name, which is it's general, so which is the opposite of specific. So if a marathon is specific, but running and lifting and jumping and throwing and carrying, that's general. I would say that even if you're training for something specific, which I am, you should include general training, which I am, because I'm not a marathon runner. I'm a bloke that is trying to run a fast marathon for me. But I also have to do other stuff. Like today, had an axe and was chopping down a tree. So if I went so specific on marathoning, I would lose the general qualities that are going to be useful as a person. Now, if you're an Olympic marathoner preparing for the Olympics, then you can lose some of these traits. But for a firefighter, all of those general qualities are going to be far more important than anything you can do specifically. This is just not for the person that asked the question, but for everyone else. With an approach to GPP, it makes sense to keep it simple. So you want to include some resistance training and some cardio training, some mobility training. The mobility, I think, can fit in throughout the day, so it doesn't need to be at a specific venue. So there's a bit more flexibility. And I would just say get it in when you can. When it comes to the lifting, I would focus on the what's the phrase that minimal effective dose. Minimal effective dose. I knew it was in my brain somewhere. So you're doing the most with the least, which is probably going to be 2 sessions a week. But those 2 sessions could be 30 minutes. And I would think in terms of planes of movement. So you've got a squat, which is obvious, a hinge, which is like a deadlift or a kettlebell swing, push horizontal, push vertical, and then a pull vertical and a pull horizontal. And then you could do some carries, which is going to be your farmer's carries, your suitcase carries. So you could divvy up those any which way you want. You can have an upper, lower, or you can have a push, pull, or 1,000 other variants, but say those are 2 sessions. And then you would do some cardio. If the recommendations in general for people to survive, thrive, / not die. So for just general civilians, it's about 150 minutes a week, which that sounds reasonable. So that could be 5 30-minute sessions, or you could do any which way you like, 3 50-minute sessions. And then you can get those in wherever you like. And there's going to be some interference, but then looking at the lifestyles as you've spoken to it, there's going to be interference and compromises in any direction. When it comes to making a choice, if someone has had a stressful couple of days and their sleep's compromised, and then I would err on the side of doing less. Acknowledge that there's a minimal amount of work to be done, but if the person doing that work isn't in a place to tolerate it, then doing more than they can tolerate is more than needs to be done and more that's beneficial, and also is more likely to occur in overuse injuries, but also just stress disorders, which could be anxiety, but also fatigue from a lack of recovery. So I would think of doing enough and not more than enough. I would think of the types of movement I've mentioned, mobility throughout the day, and to do cardio. And most of that, I'd say 80% of it, let's just keep it simple. So they hold 80-20, do 80% in your T2 steady. So that could either be nose breathing is a great limiter, and that could be running if you're fit enough, but stationary bike, riding an actual bike, rucking, so it's walking with a 10 to 25% of your body weight would be useful if you can tolerate it, which is to say I'd work up to it for those that aren't experienced. But if you're talking about firefighters, and it says first responders, but I think this person had asked me about fireys in particular, you're going to need to be able to carry, but I'd imagine a lot of that would already be in the program. So hope that helps. Number 3, would be interested in knowing on how to differentiate between junk volume and necessary volume with respect to rowing kilometers. I've heard this term a lot, but this is junk volume is the term. A lot, but I'm unsure of what constitutes too much volume. The Irish lightweight double, the one gold in Paris, did up to 400 kilometers per week at their peak. I'm unsure as to what the ratio of erg/water this was. Clearly their approach worked as the double Olympic champions. As a masters lightweight indoor rower, I'd be interested in knowing whether I'm doing too much at 200 kilometers a week or whether half the volume is more efficient. Well, it's definitely more efficient because more volume does not equal a proportionate increase in performance. So beyond a point, it's diminishing returns. But there are still returns. So there is still a benefit in doing a lot of volume. 400 clicks a week seems like a lot of volume. Hold on. But the key thing I'd like to mention here is it's the volume that you can tolerate, and tolerate in terms of the volume that you can endure and survive, which is to say, none of those words quite capture it. You have to be able to absorb the training. So if you have the time and you have the lifestyle, so the lighties that you mentioned, those guys doing that sort of volume, at least at that portion of the season, they're full-time athletes. And as a masters rower, you're not. So you're fitting it around work, you're fitting it around family potentially. And so you have less recoverability than these athletes that are younger and elite at that sport. So they are going to be able to do more volume than you. So jug volume for them is different than jug volume for you. You might be able to squeeze more in, but that might not make you any better. And what I'm finding is that there's this sweet spot that's different for different people under different circumstances. I would err on the side of seeing how little you can do and then only add in as it makes sense. So if you can elicit any performance outcome, improve performance outcomes with less, then do less. And then if you add in more and you get better, then great. If you add in more and you're starting to feel more injury prone, more fatigued, more inconsistent, then it's too much. So you just have to pay attention to how well you're absorbing the work and to not have ego involved. Think of it in terms of what is going to be the most effective here. Not there's no gold medals for who does the most training, only for who's the fastest. Oh, okay. There's 2 questions here. Well, there's three, and well, I'll answer one, and I might leave the others for next week. Because one of them is looking back at your career. What's one training or recovery method I don't need to read the whole thing. I'll save it, but it speaks to the training that I'm doing currently and how I adjust it when life happens. And one question, this I can't believe this is going to be the last question. It's not going to be one that I can answer succinctly. Oh no, how about this? How about after dicking you all around here, I'll find one that I can answer relatively succinctly. And that's, do you struggle staying optimistic about clean sports? I recently finished the Jan Ulrich doco, The Hunted. I haven't seen that, but I was watching a lot of Letour during the Ulrich Armstrong era. And so I'm curious. Evidently, a supremely talented young athlete got caught up and manipulated by the ills of sports drive for big business. Sadly, however, it leaves the viewer thinking history will repeat itself. Well, in professional cycling, as most of you would be aware, there's been this long precedent for doping, as there is in a lot of elite sport, and usually the harder the sports, the more financial remuneration, the more likelihood that there is going to be doping. I would say that because you've asked specifically, do you struggle staying optimistic about clean sports? And I say, no, I don't struggle because I'm not I'm not optimistic about it. I've too many reasons to believe that a lot of athletes are doping, and I felt that in sports that I was competing in. I felt that in rowing because there were times when, well, for example, in 2008, I was in the Australian men's eight that missed out on qualification the year before by one spot. The Russian crew was disqualified. They were injecting creatine, which is strange because it's legal to take creatine, but it's illegal to inject it. And the syringes were found in their rooms. And so those guys were disqualified. So the Australian eight was promoted to qualification, which meant that we didn't need to go through qualification in the Olympic years. So that's doping, at least in principle. It happened. So they caught it. Does that make me more or less optimistic? Not really. It just means that I'm a realist, and I understand that countries only have a certain amount of money they can spend on sport, and they have to be looking at what purpose does this thing serve for our country in terms of nation building, international presence, and do we invest more fully in improving performance or in maintaining the ethics of fair competition? And so I could think of the Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, some of the European countries, some I've probably not mentioned are doing a good job. And then there's a lot that really aren't. So just Russia, China, no, I don't put any stock in them maintaining clean athletes for most of the year. There would be clean athletes in a lot of sports, but there would also be a not, and it's state sanctioned, so they've got at least this massive chunk of the year where they're not only unsupervised, but they're being provided with drugs. And so why would I be optimistic about any of that? In cycling, I do still watch the tour. Cycling and mixed martial arts are basically the two sports that I pay attention to as a fan. And there's been a lot of doping in both of those, because part of what increases the likelihood of doping and increases the reasons for me to watch it is that they're bloody hard sports. And so the stakes are really high. And so there's this incentive and a benefit to an athlete doing what they can. And so often they will. And sometimes they're going to get caught and sometimes they're not. And I would hope for an even playing field, but I just don't believe that's the case because of the experiences I've had. Case in point, and this is anecdotal, but in the Olympics in Beijing, there was the Chinese men's lightweight four weighed in by themselves, whereas crew, the rest of the crews, the rest of the lightweight fours, they had to weigh in together elsewhere, which is really sketchy, which just makes it super skeptical as to whether or not they actually even made weight. And then there was this other incident where there was a weird guy in the toilets, in the bathrooms all week. He was kind of near the cleaners, but not doing any cleaning, not doing anything other than just smoking cigarettes, always around. And then I saw him at one point, and a teammate of mine, we sort of all convened at this cross section where it was me, a teammate who's coming out of the bathroom, I'm going in, and the guy that smokes cigarettes, at least in the toilets, is given this like crumpled up garbage bag to one of the guys in the Chinese men's eight. Now, I don't know what's in that bag, but I know that there's no reason that those two should have even had anything to do with each other. And if you saw some of those guys, it would raise suspicion. Now, they were slower than us. So did it have any adverse effect? No. But I know enough to know that maybe not in rowing, but in a lot of countries, there's a differences in the extent to which anti-doping measures are enforced. And so it's already unfair. So mostly how I deal with this is just hope for the best, but I try not to, I just don't care that much to pay that much attention, because it falls into this thing of the dichotomy of control, which I will talk about a lot. And it's this concept where there are things you can control and there are things you cannot. And what other people put into their body is not within my control. So I try not to think about it too much and just focus on myself and my own performances and trying to learn from others and share with you. And that's that. Okay. That's episode 1 for Solo Sam, which is probably going to be episode 7. I'll do these weekly, even if I have to force myself to. I hope you find it enjoyable. If you have questions for next week, in addition to the questions that I alluded to this week and did not answer, feel free to submit them. I will answer them if it's a good question. So you got a feeling for the sort of questions that I'm likely to answer this week. So if you'd like me to pay attention to the things that are on your mind, send me a DM and I'll do that. Until then, all the best.